Welcome to week 3. This part is entitled The Therapist's Failures of the Patient. And you'll see it's going to be a story about both Model 2 and Model 3 and distinguishing a little bit between them. Unlike Model 2, which pays scant attention to the patient's proactivity in relation to the therapist, Model 3 addresses itself specifically to the force field created by the patient who, under the sway of her repetition compulsion, and for reasons, as we had discussed in an earlier section, for reasons both healthy and not, is ever intent upon recreating on the stage of her life and in the transference through projective identification the unmastered, unresolved, early on relational traumas by drawing the therapist in to participating in ways specifically determined by the patient's early on developmental history. And that's taken from Patrick Casement. The patient ever busy drawing the therapist in, the patient with the need to be failed is ever busy drawing the therapist in to participating in ways specifically determined by the patient's early on developmental history, said Patrick Casement. And I go on to add, internally recorded and structuralized in the form of pathogenic introjects or internal bad objects and dysfunctional relational configurations. But again, in pairs, victimizer-victim, seducer-seducee, rejector-rejectee, criticizer-criticizee, in introjective configurations, as William Meissner would call them. Importantly, center stage for both self-psychologists and relational theorists, kind of the Model 3 folks, are the inevitable empathic failures of self-psychology, as it's described in Model 2, the inevitable empathic failures of self-psychology, Model 2, and the inevitable relational failures of contemporary relational theory, Model 3. But the two models conceive of such failures very differently. And the answer relates to the previous slide where I spoke to the force field created by the patient, ever busy continuously replaying on the stage of her life old dramas. All right, so Model 2 talks about inevitable empathic failures. Model 3 talks about inevitable relational failures. In any event, inevitable failures by the therapist. But the two models, Model 2 versus Model 3, conceive of such failures very differently. Self-psychologists, Model 2, contend that failures are unavoidable, inevitable, because the therapist is not and cannot be expected to be perfect. By contrast, most relational theorists, Model 3, believe that the therapist's failures are a story about not just the therapist and the therapist's inevitable lack of perfection, but also the patient and the patient's inevitable enactment, it's actually sort of reenactment, of her unconscious need to be failed, so that she can achieve belated mastery of her unmastered, unresolved, early on relational traumas. To that end, Model 3, the patient is seen as continuously exerting interpersonal pressure. Jim Grotstein had talked about that, as does Stephen Mitchell. Interpersonal pressure on the therapist to participate in old, familial, and therefore familiar ways. Reenactments to which the therapist will find herself continuously and unconsciously reacting. Notice my use of the word reacting and not responding. Continuously and unconsciously, defensively reacting. In other words, the relational therapist failures, Model 3, are seen as co-created as occurring in the context of an ongoing and continuously evolving relationship between two authentic selves, two relational objects, and as speaking to the therapist's unwitting receptivity to the patient's provocative enactment of her unconscious need to be failed. Let me say that again. So whereas in Model 2, the empathic therapist's failures are seen as inevitable because it's a story about the therapist. No one can be expected to be perfect, so it is inevitable that the therapist will empathically fail the patient, Model 2. But in Model 3, the therapist's failures are seen as co-created, in part a story about the therapist, yes, but also a story about the patient and the patient's exerting of pressure on the therapist to fail her in the old familial and therefore familiar ways. And so Model 3, then, the failures speak to the therapist's unwitting receptivity to the patient's provocative enactments of her unconscious need to be failed. The unhealthy component of which has to do with it's all she's ever known. Anything else would make her too anxious. The healthy component of which has to do with the patient's healthy need to achieve belated mastery, for there to be the experience of bad, she's failed, become good. Once the therapist brings to bear the therapist's own more evolved capacity to process and integrate on behalf of the patient who truly does not know how. Please note, this slightly different point here, the importance of the therapist's capacity, all of us, our capacity, both to tolerate being seen as bad or disillusioning, Model 2, and to tolerate actually being made bad and becoming bad as we respond to the patient's force field. Again, in Model 2, the patient is seen as a passive recipient of what's given to her. In Model 3, the patient is seen as more of an agent pulling for a certain kind of reaction from the therapist, such that the patient can have the experience of old bad, recreating, refinding old bad, and then the opportunity for the experience of something different, a better resolution, something better. So important that we, if we're going to facilitate the work that gets done in Models 2 and Model 3, that we be able to tolerate being seen as disillusioning and bad, and that we be able to tolerate being made bad by way of the patient's projective identification. If the Model 2 empathic therapist cannot tolerate, at least every now and then, breaking the patient's heart, thereby affording the patient the experience of good become bad, the therapist will be robbing the patient of the opportunity adaptively to internalize missing psychological or parenting or self-object functions by way of optimal or affective disillusionment and transmuting or structure-building internalizations. And again, structures perform functions that enable capacity. So these transmuting internalizations, by definition, allow for the accretion of internal psychic regulatory structure and adaptive capacities. So too, that was Model 2. So too, if the Model 3 relational therapist refuses to participate as someone who, at least every now and then, initially re-traumatizes, but ultimately relents, thereby affording the patient the experience of bad become good, the therapist will be robbing the patient of the opportunity to rework her introjected boluses of toxicity by way of serial dilution and relational detoxification. And again, earlier I talked about, I guess in the previous week, I had talked about the patients who come to me for consultation. And I will want to know, in essence, have you ever experienced your therapist as bad or disappointing or disillusioning, model 2? Or have you ever actually encountered your therapist as actually being bad, model 3, the induction phase of the projective identification? And so often the patients will say, well, no, my therapist is wonderful, and I'm only filled with gratitude towards her. And again, that's great, that's lovely, and important as backdrop for the therapeutic process. But it will be clear to me that the therapist's difficulty tolerating being seen as bad is part of what's getting in the way of the patient's evolving from relentless pursuit of the unattainable to acceptance, and from compulsive and unwitting reenactments on the stage of her life to accountability for her dysfunctional relational actions, reactions, and interactions. Now, an aside, parenthetically, in the psychoanalytic literature, internalize tends to imply positive, as is true for the transmuting internalizations that are center stage in self-psychology, model 2. Whereas introject tends to imply negative, as is true for the pathogenic introjects of contemporary relational theory, model 3. In fact, internalizing good is at the heart of the therapeutic action in model 2, as we know, by way of grieving optimal disillusionments, which are the optimal stressors. Whereas introjecting bad, that's not at the heart of the therapeutic action, but that informs our understanding of how model 3 psychopathology develops in the first place, and then gives us a hint as to how it can then be therapeutically modified, i.e. this internal bad, the interjected bad objects, the pathogenic interjects, will need to be delivered into the relationship, and it'll be in the context of the two-person intersubjective relationship that there can be transformation and growth. The patient on her own is not going to be able to modify if she's hating herself, she feels bad about herself, she's self-critical, that's where the superego stuff comes in that I'd referenced, I think, in the first week. If she's ever busy beating on herself, hating her guts, and all sorts of aggressive, superego-y type dysfunctional relational stuff that she's playing out internally, she's not really going to be able to kind of modify that or detoxify it, but for being able to deliver it into the relationship. We used to talk about make the distinction way back between neurosis and character disorder. And neurosis, the patient herself suffers, but the world doesn't. Character disordered patients make the world suffer. In essence, in model 3, for it to be effective, for the therapeutic action to be able to take place, we are inviting the patient to be momentarily character disordered, to deliver her pathogenic interjects, her dysfunctional relational configurations and dynamics into the treatment, onto the stage of the treatment. We're inviting her to be a character disorder so that we can have access to something to which we would otherwise not have had access. And we can then lend aspects of our own more evolved capacity to ultimately, to process, integrate, and adapt, and ultimately to relent and to hold ourselves accountable for the part that we are playing in this drama, the dramatic reenactment that is being played out in the stage, with our contributing by way of our reactivity to the patient's need for us to be failed. All right, last slide in this part. More specifically, now this is a little complicated. If you don't understand it, you can just forget it. But I just felt a little compelled to put it in here. How does the patient handle? I wanted to compare Heinz Kohut and W.R.D. Fairbairn. Kohut, self-psychology; Fairbairn, object relations, who emphasizes the internal presence of bad. How does the patient handle disappointment from the point of view of Kohut, from the point of view of Fairbairn? And it's different. So here we go. In the aftermath of disappointment, Kohut writes about internalizing good by way of grieving, optimal disillusionment, and then the adaptive, transmuting internalizations of the good that had been there prior to the empathic failure, prior to the introduction of the bad. So in the aftermath of disappointment or disillusionment, says Kohut, the patient then will internalize good. And that's, as we had just commented, that's where the therapeutic action in Model 2, what that's all about. And now, interestingly, and it was years before I realized this, as it happens in self-psychology, there are no bad objects. There are no pathogenic introjects. There's no internal presence of bad. In Kohut's formulations, only absence of good, structural deficits as a result of good not internalized. But it's not that bad is internalized. That's for Model 3. Rather, it's good that is not internalized. There are not the transmitting internalizations, and therefore there are deficits, which will then create the need for the new object to provide external provision of regulation of self-esteem and good feelings about the self. All right, that was Kohut. Now let's do Fairbairn. In the aftermath of disappointment, Fairbairn writes about introjecting bad as the burden of the mother's badness. He says mother, we'll say parent, whatever, but the parent's badness falls upon the patient. Well, so Kohut says in the aftermath of disappointment, you internalize good, and Fairbairn says, oh no, in the aftermath of disappointment, you introject bad. So, I mean, how do we reconcile these two discrepant perspectives? I mean, put them back to back, and Kohut and Fairbairn, how do we do this? Now, meanwhile, of course, it's all kind of made up anyway, what goes on inside. But to the extent that it can be useful clinically, that's why we like to talk about what we imagine is going on inside the little one's head. All right. So how do we reconcile these two discrepant perspectives? Well, we can use Kohut's transmuting internalizations to inform our Model 2 understanding of what happens in the aftermath of grieving non-traumatic or optimal, mean the same thing, non-traumatic disappointment. That is, what happens when things go right. Because again, the non-traumatic or optimal disillusionments, disappointments, the optimal stress of that, if that can indeed be grieved, and by definition, if it can be grieved, it becomes optimal. There's kind of a tautology there, whatever. But transmuting internalizations help us to understand what happens when things go right. We take in, we internalize good. We can then use Fairbairn's introjection of badness concept to inform our Model 3 understanding of what happens in the aftermath, not of optimal disappointment, optimal non-traumatic disappointments that get grieved, but rather in the aftermath of traumatic disappointment. Fairbairn, I believe, was talking about traumatic disappointment. And in a later section, I'm going to talk much more about how Fairbairn conceptualizes how it comes to pass that the burden of the parent's badness falls upon the little one. So in other words, Fairbairn's interjection of badness to inform our understanding of what happens in the aftermath of traumatic disappointment, i.e., what happens when things go very wrong. Okay.